Eucalyptus is well known to everyone in Australia. It occurs from across the breadth of the country, from our driest ecosystems, the mallee and the arid zone, through to our tall wet forests, the wet sclerophyll forests, some magnificent examples of mountain ash, Eucalyptus regnans, through to the alpine zone, and then all the way to the tropics. So really, it is a genus that is incredibly ecologically diverse in an Australian context. It occurs across all that vast variety that is the Australian landscape. And it is a beautiful plant. It has fantastic flowers, the bark and textures that it has are just absolutely brilliant. And so if we look at a map of all the collections that have ever been made of eucalyptus, and this is a plot of all the herbarium specimens that exist, apart from the fact that you can see botanists always collect on road lines, you'll see really the breadth of the genus across the Australian landmass. And of course, that doesn't necessarily sample the full range, but it represents all the specimens that exist in herbarium collections. So given that breadth of diversity and ecological range, what can we really learn from the fossil record? And so for those of you that aren't familiar with geological timescales and the fossil record, I thought I would have to put some information up to start things off. So the Cretaceous period, the period in green, the time of the dinosaurs, we can see that flowering plants first appear right at the base of that period of geological time. Around about 100 million years ago, the breadth of diversity that we see today, about 75% of the diversity we see today in flowering plants, that really first started to appear in the fossil record, the radiation of what we call the eudicots. And the eudicots are distinguished by one particular character, and that is their pollen has 3 apertures to it, which we'll come to a little bit later on. And of course, having radiated at 100 million years, they went right through that well-known event, the Cretaceous tertiary mass extinction, when something ran into the earth and wiped out, or some of us would have some of us believe that wiped out most of life. In fact, that event in Earth history is really very impactful in the Northern Hemisphere, but less so in the Southern Hemisphere. So while we see ecological disruption at that boundary, we don't really see major extinction events. The vegetation changes, but things that were there before the boundary, at least as far as the plants go, tend to come back, albeit in different associations. The Eocene is the next arrow up, round about, well, between 33 and 50, what have we got on there, 54.5 million years. That's a period in Earth history where the Earth's incredibly warm, much warmer than today, and probably analogous to what people are predicting the climate to be like. And so during the Eocene period, we had rainforest extending all the way down into Tasmania. We can find palm foliage in Tasmania, and even down into the Antarctic. So there's some recent research out looking at sediments of that age in the Antarctic, where you've got tropical groups such as the Bombycaceae and a whole range of other things there. So really the tropics were very wide, and of course that means that plants move around. And then up in the Oligocene and Miocene, that much more recent history, only a few tens of millions of years ago, when the Australian continent started to dry out and the vegetation started to become similar to what we see today. So with those things in mind, I want to have a little bit of a tour of the history of eucalyptus and what we can tell from the fossil record. Paleobotanically, we can get evidence of what past life was like from a whole range of different sources. Fossilised wood, for example, is one source, and we can look at the anatomy in the same way that we can look at the structure in these trees out here, and we can make those comparisons and see what type of wood we've got. Problem with wood is it's rather conservative, so it's very difficult to segregate out genera. So there's a little bit of a discrimination problem there. But there are some in situ trees from the early Miocene, about 23 million years ago, from New South Wales, and they're been entombed by lava flows. So some lava flows buried the vegetation, petrified those trees, and a study of those trees suggests they're eucalyptus. So that's a pretty interesting record, but there's not a lot of other wood of eucalyptus known. In fact, that's probably the only really good record that we've come across. The pollen, as I mentioned, it's got 3 apertures on it. It's got 3 holes in it. It's triangular in shape, very small. And some recent studies have tried to use that to see if we can understand the history of eucalyptus and other myrtaceous genera. But unfortunately, only 9 different types of pollen can be identified looking at the living plants. So when you look at the living plants, the pollen's rather conservative. There's 130 odd genera, but we can only recognise 9 pollen types. So they're not particularly useful, the pollen, for identifying down to the level that we want to do. Other lines of evidence are things like leaves, and there are some characters in the leaves that we can use. Again, their discrimination is not as great as having flowers and fruits, which of course contain the key characters that we need to identify the fossil record of this group. So I'll just start with the leaf record, just so we can look and see what's known of the leaves. So here's some living leaves. They're not fossilised, but you'll see some of the fossil ones are really very similar. Some of the characteristics are right at the edge of the leaf there, you can see a little vein. That's very distinctive, particularly for the family Myrtaceae. It's not necessarily diagnostic for Eucalyptus, but it is distinctive of that family. And also you'll see close up that there are a lot of oil glands, and of course the oil glands are economically important from some species. So there's a couple of features there that you can see in the leaves that help you have some confidence you might be looking at Eucalyptus. And some of the records that we have in Australia are quite local to here. So in the late Oligocene, so 30 odd million years ago, there were 7 leaf types described from Wilson Botanic Garden, which used to be an old quarry. And there's leaf beds there now under the quarry water at Wilson Botanic Garden. And there was a big collection made of those. And here's some examples of the leaves that come out of there. And you can see they've got that distinctive shape. The venation patterns are also consistent with Myrtaceae, and there are some fruits known from there as well. So good evidence that these are Eucalyptus. And there's a more recent study by Dahl in '93 where they looked at some cuticular features as well. That's not the sole record. There are a number of other records. Here's some examples, an example from Western Australia. You can see the challenge that we have with working with some of this material. The preservation isn't great. There's not a lot of detail in there, but in parts of that leaf you can see that intramarginal vein and a range of other things that allow you to place that within Eucalyptus. And of course, the interesting thing here is this flora has the things that we typically associate with Australian vegetation. It has a lot of sclerophyll elements within it. So we're starting to see hints of the Australian vegetation develop in these Oligocene floras. If we go a bit further back in time, there are some other leaves. Again, these have these intramarginal veins. They have evidence of oil glands, and from this particular flora, and that reference at the bottom's wrong, by the way, but don't worry about that. These are myrtaceous leaves, but we haven't really confirmed whether there's eucalyptus in there, although we suspect there is. And then probably the best examples we have are these early Eocene leaves. So these are 52 million year old leaves. You can clearly see that intramarginal vein. You can clearly see the oil glands on the leaves. So the structures of those leaves are consistent. The leaf record for the genus extends from the early Eocene, so about 52 million years ago, all the way through to the Pliocene. There's numerous records in the Oligocene and Miocene, but some other genera of Myrtaceae can be similar. So what I now want to do is look at things that are really much more definitive, the fruit record. Again here, middle Miocene, so very young. These are around 22 million years old. Described as eucalyptus, there's leaves that we've seen before, but there are also these fruits associated with it, the typical inflorescences, the capsule, and various other characters that allow us to place that within this genus. And here's another example from the Miocene, not as well preserved, but again, you can see those things we typically associate with the capsules. And then these early Eocene examples as well, these beautiful umbels, classic fruits on them, and a number of features on those fruits have allowed this particular specimen to be placed within the group we call Symphyomyrtus. So we've got quite a good record of leaves, flowers and fruits, and this really summarises those observations within that framework. So from about 52 million years forward, a real peak in abundance in the Oligocene and Miocene, up around that 23, 25 million years, and a real interesting pattern of distribution. This just summarises that in terms of that original diagram that I showed, where that fits in terms of the timing of appearance of flowering plants, radiation of the eudicots, and then Eucalyptus coming in much more recently in the record, although, of course, 52 million years is quite some time ago. The other interesting thing, of course, is that early Eocene example. So that early Eocene example is one of the oldest examples. So let's just think about that for a minute. It's within the Symphyomyrtus group. So you can see the Symphyomyrtus group there. You can see the three different groups of Eucalypts, or Eucalyptus as we know them, Symphyomyrtus, the Monocalypts and the Eudesmids. And that fossil fits within the Symphyomyrtus. So the implications of that are that those other groups, which are further down the tree, must have also been present at that time. So what that fossil's telling us is in the early Eocene, we're not seeing a lot of the diversity that should have existed. A number of the other lineages of Eucalyptus existed at that time. So although we think of it as this group that's typically iconically Australian, the diversity there goes a long way back. It goes back way before 50 million years. And it goes way back into that period of time when Australia was dominated by rainforests, which is an interesting observation in itself. Here's the kicker, I guess. We've been talking about a group which we regard as iconically Australian, but ironically, the best preserved fossils, these ones here, are from South America. So Eucalyptus was in South America, and that Eucalyptus group is in the Symphyomyrtus. So Symphyomyrtus was in South America, which means that diversity that we've got today, how widespread was that in Earth history? We think of this group typically as an Australian group, but that early picture I showed you of Eucalyptus, this is actually an extra Australian species. This is the rainbow gum. So not an Australian species at all, one that grows outside the Australian region. So we've got extra Australian eucalypts. We've got eucalypts in South America in the early Eocene. We've also got eucalyptus, some of those other fossils I showed you were New Zealand fossils. It was in New Zealand in the middle Miocene, and in Australia it's got that Eocene to Pliocene record. And in general, the fossil record's considered poor. It's probably better than we thought when you start to look at the detail, but it's generally considered a pretty poor fossil record. So what does that mean? And it raises a whole lot of interesting questions, at least for me. Why did it die out on those other continents? I mean, why was it successful here? When was it successful here? What ecological niches did it occupy in that period in the fossil record? And does that perhaps give us some ideas for what's happened? And when did it become iconically Australian? Both the New Zealand and South American records are interesting because they're associated with volcanic deposits. They're associated with what are called Maar lakes. And in particular, the South American occurrence is this massive volcano that's sitting in the middle of rainforest. A whole lot of Australian rainforest species are in that flora. But at certain periods of time in that sequence, you get horizons that are just full of eucalyptus. And similarly, the New Zealand record is also in a Maar volcano environment. We don't really know what distribution it has within those environments in New Zealand, but it's interesting that there are those parallels there. And so it seems that volcanic disturbance and fires associated with volcanoes might even actually have been a mechanism for eucalyptus to become a dominant element in floras of South America, New Zealand and Australia. So to me, eucalyptus might be an iconic Australian today, but perhaps not so in the past. And I'd just like to leave you with that thought. Thank you.